If you were being terrorized by an evil spirit and its band of murdering cult members, what would you do? In this video, we'll cover everything you should and shouldn't do if you want to survive against the Empty Man after summoning him. It all kicked off in 1995 when four friends, Greg, Fiona, Ruthie, and Paul, decide to go mountain hiking. After a while, they reach what appears to be a religious shrine and a worn-down bridge. After crossing the bridge, the gang stops to take in the view, and Paul comments that he hears something strange coming from the distance. The rest of the hikers don't hear anything, which leads Paul to walk off to investigate the source of noise. He doesn't make it far before falling down into a crevice and disappearing into the darkness below. Let's take a break here and talk about Paul's biggest mistake: not looking where he was going on a literal mountain range. If you are going to enjoy the beauty of nature, you have to do it carefully. Being even a little aware of his surroundings might have kept him out of the hole and kept his friends from having to go in after him. Pro tip: keep an eye on your clumsy friends while mountain hiking. It could save their life and yours. After seeing Paul fall into the crevice, Greg immediately jumps into action and heads down after him. He finds Paul sitting silent, almost as if in a trance, right in front of the skeletal remains of some four-armed humanoid creature. Greg inspects the skeleton, noting the extra limbs, huge hands, and other skulls placed at his feet. He quickly realizes he needs to get out of there and try to snap Paul out of it so they can leave. As he approaches him, Paul whispers, Of course, Greg ignores this and grabs Paul anyway, who begins to cry. After dragging him out of the pit, the gang hightails it back across the bridge and takes refuge in a house nearby after getting caught in a major snowstorm. The next day, Ruthie is chased by some menacing figure out in the snowstorm and catches Paul chanting something in her ear while she was sleeping. It isn't long after this that the gang starts to realize something is not right with Paul, who is slowly being possessed by the Empty Man. He disappears, and they find him back at the bridge, playing a flute. Greg finally blows up and tells Paul that the whole situation is his fault and that he's been dealing with his selfishness for years. Paul begins to chant, and Ruthie pulls a knife out and stabs Greg in the back before throwing him off a cliff. She then turns the knife on Fiona, slicing her throat and tossing her over the cliffside. Paul and Ruthie share one last look before she throws herself over as well. So, what could have been done to avoid this? Let's talk about that. First off, the most obvious mistake was made by Greg, who touched Paul after being told he would die if he did so. Now, it may just be me, but if someone tells me I'm going to die if I touch something, believe me, I'm not touching it. We can't really blame Greg for not taking it seriously, but it turns out to have had some major consequences. Another key mistake that the group made was not being aware of the weather in the area before setting out on the hike. Being more aware of the weather could have helped them avoid the snowstorm that kept them trapped out there with the Empty Man. There wasn't much chance for Greg to fight back as he was caught off guard, but Fiona could have fought back or ran off to attempt to survive. As far as fighting off possession goes, it's hard to say exactly how this could have been avoided. Your best bet is to avoid creepy religious shrines tucked away in the mountains. If you believe someone you know has been possessed by an evil spirit, tie them up and get out of there as fast as you can. This approach might have saved the rest of the hiking crew and kept the Empty Man out in the mountains where he belongs. Years after the events in the mountains, a former detective named James is getting pulled into some trouble brewing in his neighborhood. His friend, Nora, a widowed single mother, has a daughter named Amanda that has run away, leaving behind the message, "The Empty Man made me do it," written in blood. Deciding to do some investigating on his own, he meets up with Amanda's friend, Deborah, who reveals to him that Amanda had recently encouraged her and their friends to summon the Empty Man. To do this, you must find an empty bottle on a bridge and blow into it while thinking of the Empty Man. James takes this information and heads to the bridge where it all went down. Once he gets there, he can't resist the urge to try and summon the Empty Man himself, taking a nearby bottle and blowing into it. While checking under the bridge, he finds a grisly sight as he discovers the hanging bodies of Brandon and the rest of Amanda's friends. Nearby, the same message written in blood, "The Empty Man made me do it." So how could Brandon and the rest of his friends avoided this fate? Well, they could have followed the golden rule, don't mess with the occult. What seemed like good fun at the time turned out to have some serious consequences. A good rule of thumb is don't summon the Empty Man just because you're bored on the weekend. Meanwhile, Deborah is enjoying some time in the steam room when a shrouded figure appears and stabs her to death with scissors. Only, it turns out, she was stabbing herself the whole time. Her death would be ruled a suicide, but that wouldn't stop James from digging deeper into the legend of the Empty Man. His investigation takes him to the Pontifex Institute, where he finds a cult that believes in tulpas, imaginary beings that come to life through sheer mind power alone. The cult's leader, Arthur, makes a reference to the Empty Man, which raises some red flags for James. Arthur tells him that the Empty Man is an entity that provides his followers with anything they want as long as they do what it tells them to. James leaves and starts being plagued with visions of the Empty Man, leading him to follow the cult members to a cabin in the woods. In the cabin, he finds files on Amanda, himself, and even Paul stashed away. He eventually stumbles upon the cult performing some kind of ritual in the woods. They spot him and take chase, but he is able to escape. He returns to Nora to let her know that he believes Amanda is involved in the Empty Man cult, taking her to a nearby hotel for safety. At this point, the hallucinations are hitting James hard. Turns out, summoning the Empty Man on the bridge was a bad idea. Frustrated and afraid, he ambushes a cult member named Garrett to find out what's happening to him. Garrett tells him that there is a man in the hospital that is being used by the Empty Man to transmit instructions to the cult. James makes his way up to find this man, who turns out to be Paul, who has fallen into a coma due to being the Empty Man's vessel. It turns out, a human can only host the Empty Man for so long before dying, a fact revealed by Amanda, who is keeping watch over Paul. She then tells James that he too is to become the new vessel for the Empty Man. It turns out James has been nothing more than a tulpa manifested by Amanda this whole time. That's right, all the memories, relationships, and feelings he's ever felt were merely a fabrication by Amanda to ensure that the Empty Man would have a new vessel when Paul died. In reality, James has only existed for a few days. A phone call to Nora confirms this, as she suddenly has no idea who he is. This causes him to have a full-on breakdown, where he finds himself in a strange dimension. It is here that the Empty Man finally takes over his body and his purpose is fulfilled. Back in the hospital, James rises up and quickly executes Paul. Several cult members have gathered into the hospital room and all bow to the new vessel of the Empty Man. Definitely not a happy ending to the story. So I'm not sure what would be worse, being killed by the Empty Man or finding out that you were a tulpa, manifested for the sole purpose of being his vessel. Either way, James got a really raw deal in the end. This whole situation could have been avoided if Paul just looked where he was going when stomping around that mountaintop. There are actually some people who believe in the power of tulpas, so you might be one and not even know it. What would you have done if you accidentally summoned the Empty Man? Or how would you feel if you found out you were just an imaginary friend some high school girl manifested? Let us know down in the comments, and thanks for watching.